Stan, for that introduction. Thank you, General Miller. Thank you for the invitation to come to speak at Sovereign Challenge. First time I spoke at Sovereign Challenge, I think, was in 2004, so it's a wonderful program. So today, I'm going to talk about three things. The first is, what is the message that ISIS is giving out? What's its appeal to the people who are joining? Secondly, I'm going to look at who are the people who are joining ISIS based on a data set of 446 militants that the foundation I work at a foundation called New America. We've assembled this from public records and news accounts. We focused on Western countries because there's better data that is available on Western countries. So we have 25 Western countries, and I can tell you what our findings are. They are not public yet. And finally, what can be done? So those are the three sort of, what's the appeal, who is going, what can be done? So what's the appeal? I think it's fairly obvious that if Vietnam was the first television war and the Gulf War was the first cable news war that was available 24/7, what is going on in Syria is the first social media war. And everything, in a sense, that is important for us to know about Syria is happening on social media. And social media is not journalism. It's a partial, tends to have a point of view. There are quite a lot of disadvantages of the fact that we know there's not very much journalism going on in Syria because it's so dangerous, and much of what we know is from social media. So what is the message that ISIS is producing? And I would say that there are 11 messages. The first one is they're winning. This is a very appealing message. They have created, they rule over territory, but some estimates is the size of the United Kingdom. They rule over, by some estimates, 8 million people. It's the population of Switzerland. And very significantly, they have abolished the borders that existed since 1916, since the secret agreement between Christopher Sykes and Picot in 1916, which basically set up what would happen after World War I, which is the British and the French would basically split up the Middle East in terms of their areas of control. And so, for instance, a very significant moment came when ISIS showed bulldozers literally demolishing the big border between Iraq and Syria. So they physically showed, we are demolishing the Sykes-Picot agreement, which is basically the agreement that has ruled over the Middle East, in a sense, for the last century or so. Abolishing all Western influence is the goal of ISIS. And they're winning. This is the big message. The second message is, we are creating an Islamic utopia. And not only is it's a utopia in all the ways that an Islamic utopia might, you might assume an Islamic utopia might be, but also coming, and if you live here, you can have a really normal life. So when you look at the videotapes of ISIS puts out, they show children at fairgrounds, having a good time. They show people that people are saying, this is a wonderful place to be. And so this message of creating an Islamic utopia. By the way, as I go through this list, if you're thinking about counter-messaging, think about what the counter-message to each one of these would be. So, a big counter-message to they're winning would be they're losing. And hopefully, the efforts that everybody's engaged in will make that a reality. A counter-message to they're creating an Islamic utopia would be say, actually, they're not. And there are various ways we could do that, and we can maybe get into that in a little bit. A third message they're producing is you can go to ISIS-controlled territory and get married to somebody with very like-minded views. And a lot of the people who are going are marrying there. And this is a powerful message as well, that instead of maybe marrying somebody your parents decide for you in some Islamic, an arranged marriage, you can go and meet somebody with your own views and you can marry them. ISIS talks about its judicial services as a point of its appeal, and a lot of the things that we find the most distasteful, I think, for some of its recruits are enticed by the fact that they are doing these punishments, such as throwing homosexuals from buildings to their deaths, or crucifying people, or beheading people. For the recruits, this is not turning them off. This is further evidence of this Islamic utopia that's being created. ISIS is virulently anti-Shia. Clearly, a lot of the videos are Shia civilians being murdered, and this is also an appealing message to a small group of people. ISIS presents itself as ushering in the end of times, and this is very important. Dabiq magazine, which is ISIS's sort of in-flight magazine in English, is named after a town in Syria where the final showdown is going to happen between the forces of Rome, i.e. the West, and the forces of Islam. And after that showdown, the Mahdi, the savior, the Islamic savior, will arrive. And in fact, ISIS says that that's going to happen in 2020. So it's very, very soon. They're bringing in the end of times. And when you think about the black flags that ISIS has, what does that mean? The black flag there's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. The hadith says, out of Khorasan, which is an old term for Afghanistan, will come the army that brings the Mahdi. So these people really believe that the end of times is in the next several years, and that they're part of that. There's also a cool factor. I mean, we see on Twitter people posing with BMWs, and there's a German rapper who's fairly well known called Deso Dog, who's now part of ISIS, and he's rapping about ISIS's great feats. The eighth message we're hearing is ISIS produces social services. So not only is it creating this Islamic utopia, but it's really a state. And there's license plates, there is police, there are ambulances, there are old people's homes. And of course, much of this isn't, I don't think they're creating a very good state, but they are creating something, certainly not something beyond the Al-Qaeda ever dreamed of. Of course, Assad is a big factor because he's the perfect villain in three ways. First of all, Assad is an Alawite, which is an heretical form of Shiism. And a lot of Muslims most people don't even really understand what Alawites believe, but it's seen as a heresy. Secondly, he's a secularist dictator, which makes him an apostate, which is the worst thing you can be in Islam. And thirdly, he's imposing a totalitarian war on his own population, on his Sunni population. So he's the perfect villain. The two other final messages one of the messages ISIS consistently says is it's really easy to join ISIS. So, for instance, it will give you Twitter contacts. There are 17 in a recent ISIS publication, there were 17 people named. Their Twitter contacts. You can send them a direct message on Twitter. They can help you get over the border into Syria. And finally, the message is, we'll take everybody. Al-Qaeda was an elite organization that took very few people. And in fact, before 9/11, even the name Al-Qaeda wasn't known to many people. If Al-Qaeda was sort of the Harvard of terrorist groups, this is kind of like the DC public school system, which is, we'll take everybody. And so those are the different messages that when I've been reviewing ISIS propaganda, I took away. So who is joining ISIS? And just to repeat, I'm focusing on the 25 Western countries where we found 446 people that have been named in public news accounts, and we basically were able to make some general findings about them. So what were the key findings? There is obviously a new demographic. Most significantly, 1 in 7 of the people who are joining ISIS are female. This is absolutely unprecedented. There were no females went to fight in the Afghan war against the Soviets. There was no movement of females to fight in the Bosnian jihad against the Serbs. There were negligible numbers of females went to the Iraq war in 2003. There's one example, Muriel de Gork, who was a Belgian female who married a Tunisian who conducted a suicide attack in 2005 in Iraq. But she was very exceptional. They're a very young group. The average age is 24. The females, by the way, average age is 21. We found 89 teenagers in this set of 446 people who had traveled to Syria. We found a third of them were active online or radicalized online. By the way, in-person recruitment is still happening, so it's not all about the online. There are people who are recruiting in person. Another very interesting thing we found is family ties were very important. A quarter of the people that we looked at had relatives fighting in Iraq or Syria, or got married in the process. In fact, a quarter of the women got married when they arrived in Syria. So marriage is an important kind of driver of some of this. When we looked at the US demographic, just now, very few Americans have gone to Syria. So there's a much larger number of group who've tried to go to Syria and were arrested before they could go. We found pretty much the same thing. 1 in 6 of them were women. Their average age was 25. About a fifth of them were teenagers. About a fifth had family ties to jihad in some way. 9 out of 10 of them were active online. Not surprising, the internet is very prevalent in the United States. Another big takeaway from the overall set of the 446 militants we looked at is Syria is much more of a graveyard than it is a launch pad for attacks in other countries. So we found that half the males were dead and 6% of the females. Now, the females are not fighting, but Syria is a very dangerous place, and some of them just get killed because they get caught in the crossfire. Half the males are dead, perhaps, that's, maybe there's focus on people who've been martyred, so that number maybe, in reality, may be lower, but the point is Syria is a very dangerous war, and most of these foreign fighters coming from the West have no military experience and they end up getting killed. We found the threat to the United States is very low. There's no examples of any foreign fighter going to Syria and then coming to the United States and conducting an attack. There's only one example of a plot of somebody who returned from Syria and he's been arrested. The threat in the West, in Europe, is larger, but it's not necessarily huge. There's only one example of an attack in Europe by a returning foreign fighter who carried out a successful attack, which was the attack in Brussels on May 24th, 2014, where a French national killed 4 people, and he'd spent a long time in Syria. We are finding, of course, that ISIS-inspired attacks are a much more serious issue. We've had those in Copenhagen, we've had those in Ottawa, we've had those in Sydney, we've had that in Garland, Texas. And so the threat is more from ISIS-inspired attacks from people who don't have any direct connection. We also, of course, we had that in Paris with Koulibaly, who was inspired by ISIS and killed 4 people in a kosher supermarket. We found that most people join ISIS. About 10% join Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. Around another 15% join other groups or other jihadi groups like Al-Sham and others in Syria. But most of the people join ISIS, and most of them go through Turkey to get there. There are very few examples of people trying other routes. So what can be done? I think there are 12 things that can be done. Some of them have been done already. Pressure on the Turks is working. If you look at ISIS propaganda, they're very concerned about Turkish officials. And they're telling, and I'm talking about, this is just in 2015, ISIS is saying, if you're challenged by a Turkish official, don't assume they're going to, it's going to be a problem. Come up with a good cover story, understand, start talking about the Blue Mosque and how you're visiting Istanbul for tourist reasons. They are also telling recruits, don't travel through Turkey directly. Don't buy a one-way ticket to Istanbul. Buy a ticket to Spain or Greece, and then buy another ticket to Turkey. So the Turkish route is becoming much less. It's really becoming more of a problem for ISIS recruits. Another approach is to get Facebook and Twitter to enforce their terms of use. This is not government censorship. This is just enforcing their terms of use. And Facebook, I think, has done a much better job of taking down material that is soliciting violence. And Twitter, which of course is a newer organization, in the last year or so has done a much better job of enforcing its own terms of use. Emphasize defections. There are people who are defecting from ISIS, and their stories should be emphasized. Engage former jihadis. You're going to hear later today from Mubin Sheikh. There's nothing more effective than having a former jihadi engage online with people and saying, hey, the promised land is not, ISIS is not going to produce the utopia you think you're going to. Obviously, reducing ISIS's territory is very important, because if you don't have a lot of territory, how can you be the caliphate? I mean, the caliphate is a physical entity. And so reducing ISIS's territory is important to reducing their appeal. Also, let's amplify the messages that ISIS is not actually doing a very good job on delivering social services. If you look at I only subscribe to one Twitter account, which is silently slaughtering Raqqa, which I think is the best account of what's really going on in Raqqa. And, they are showing pictures of bread lines. They are saying, hey, the electricity is only on 3 hours a day. And if you can undercut the claims that they're producing real social services, that's also helpful. Provide off-ramps. A number of countries are trying to get people to, move into, to persuade them that there is another way. Right now in the United States, I mean, if you're a teenager who is thinking about joining ISIS, your family's in a very, very difficult position, because merely attempting to join ISIS in this country is a 15-year prison term. So if you're a family member, you find out, hey, my kid is thinking of joining ISIS. If you go to the FBI and say, my kid is thinking of joining ISIS, your kid can end up in prison for 15 years. On the other hand, if you don't go to the FBI, your kid goes to Syria, they may well end up dead. And that's a very difficult position. And I think that, particularly in cases where there's no allegation of violence, but merely the allegation they're planning to join ISIS, we should be thinking about some kind of off-ramp that isn't 15 years in prison. And we've had one case in Minneapolis where a judge has said, hey, this is a young kid, we don't necessarily need a long prison term here, we should think about some kind of lengthy period of kind of probation and supervised release. Engage clerics who have, this is about Islam on some levels, and we're not saying that ISIS is, it's a very, very thin slice of what, but there's enough in the Quran or the Hadith that ISIS can point to sort of say we're Islamic. But any Islamic scholar can easily demolish those arguments. So, for instance, very near here in Northern Virginia, Imam Majid runs one of the biggest mosques in the United States. He has personally persuaded 5 people who are sort of part of his congregation or are part of the wider Northern Virginia Muslim population not to join ISIS, basically because he actually understands how to argue against this from a religious point of view. Educate parents about the risk of social media. A lot of Muslim parents don't know, in fact, a lot of parents in general don't really understand much about social media. And just as there are pedophiles and other kind of predators on the web, there are also these other ISIS predators. And what's interesting is there was a case in I think Washington State, and they were grooming this 23-year-old woman, and they spent thousands of hours online with her, thousands of hours. They sent her gifts. So they're grooming just like pedophiles groom people. And parents need to be aware of this risk. Crowd out bad speech with good speech. That's something you'll hear later today. A lot of imams and Muslim community leaders don't understand very well how the internet works. So, just helping, we at New America, where I work, we have a program that we've been doing with some very, very small funding from Google and Facebook, where we send somebody, her name is Rabia Chowdhury, she goes around the country training Muslim community leaders to understand how the internet works so that they can get their own messages out. A very effective message, I think, for the U.S. government. The U.S. government is not obviously, Islamic scholars, but the very simple message U.S. government can put out is, ISIS kills Muslims. This is a problem for the group, because this group, like a lot of jihadi groups, overwhelmingly they're victims of Muslim. And this is not a statement about religion, this is just a statement about fact. And finally, we need to create a database of all foreign fighters from not only the Western countries, but also, there are 4,500 have traveled from Western countries to Syria. 25,000, so 20,000 more have come from the Middle East and North Africa and other countries. And we need to understand who these people are in order to make sure that they are not a problem in the future. So that's what I had to say.